All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. Today, I'm going to talk to you joint work with my PI at University of Pennsylvania on how social context shapes value representation during learning. And I'm currently a research specialist at University of Pennsylvania, and I will be applying for PhD programs as well this cycle. So first, let me explain the motivation for our project. So an overarching theme in cognitive science is how do people or other agents like animals and robots interact with their environment? So there are really two parts to this interaction. One part is what we call decision making, which is how do agents make decisions when faced some problems in the environment. So for example, this little dude is trying to decide which path to go. Another side of this picture is that environmental input actually change agents' future behavior output. So for example, if this dude has seen this pair of decisions before and remember that, oh, there's a lion on the left path. So maybe next time when he faced this problem, he would tend to choose right because risking being eaten by a lion is probably not a good choice in comparison to searching for cherry. But given how cute this lion is, he might also choose to go left. So who knows? So the canonical computational framework for studying this kind of problem is called value-based decision-making framework. While it's called value-based decision-making, learning is integral part of it. So what this framework assumes is that the agent stores some form of value representation of different choice, and then they select the action based upon which one gives this agent the highest value. And then once the agent chooses something and gets feedback from the environment, they update this sort of value representation for future decision. However, as we've seen in the previous example, many factors come into determining which choice is more valuable for which agent. So there's also a process called outcome evaluation that's assumed to take place in between. So there are many factors that influence outcome evaluation. Some of mostly studied factors include risk, which is captured famously by the prospect theory, and also time discounting of value, which is the idea that if you give an agent reward in a longer time horizon, which is further in the future, it will become less rewarding than a more recent reward. So the picture further complicates when we consider that if you are making decisions not just for yourself, but in many cases, you're also making decisions for some other person. So let's revisit this example. This little guy cannot just make decision just based upon whether he likes cherry or a cute lion, but he has also to consider what the baby would like, right? Because he's carrying a baby in this case. So I wouldn't recommend approaching the lion in this case. So that brings us to an overarching topic in current research called social learning and decision making. And many factors actually influence how people make decisions if another person is involved. And the factors include prosociality, inequity, social distance, group membership, mental inference, etc., etc. And there are also neurological research on how the brain actually represents values. So there are some brain regions that's closer to the prefrontal cortex that people have argued to represent subjective value signals. And there are also other parts of more ancient brain regions, well, ancient evolutionarily, that actually encode reward prediction error for instrumental learning. So natural next question to ask is, whether do these two brain regions interact? Whether do these two value representations in the brain region actually talk to each other to guide people's decision-making and learning process? And in this particular project, we're interested in how do several social factors that people have established to influence subjective value signals, and the ones we're interested in are inequity and group membership, how do they channel into the subjective value signal, and in turn, perhaps also shapes learning reward signal? So that's the question we're trying to answer. So to start concrete, we build off our research based upon this previous piece of research, where social preference model was proposed. And what is a social preference model? So in this research, researchers have participants do a task called dictator game. So what's a dictator game? It's a very simple game. essentially participants are given an initial endowment. So for example, $10, okay? And then the participants have to decide how much, what proportion of that $10 is she willing to give to another person. Of course, she has one piece of information about the other person, which we call the target. That is the social group information. So the participant will know the target is a nurse or an elderly person or an Irish, for example. And then we measure their decision, their willingness to split how much of money to that target. And then the winning model reported in a paper that captures participants' choice is called the social preference model. It's essentially a weighted sum between the amount of money that participants want to keep to themselves, which is pi O in this case, pi self, and also pi O, which is the amount of share that the participant is willing to give to the target. And then the weights, alpha and beta here, are shaped by participants' social perception. And what is the social perception? So based on prior research, people figured that the social perception of certain target group can be broken down to two dimensions. Okay, one dimension captures the competence of the target, which is how likely is that target able to carry out their intentions. And another dimension is called warmth, which is how good does that target hold intention towards others. And then combined with these two dimensions, which is denoted warmth as WJ and competence as CJ here, this factor determines the weight. And this would predict the utility of each split option that the participant holds. So based off this prior research, we designed our task by combining that dictator game social information idea with an instrumental learning task. So we adapted the instrumental learning task from another literature, Collins and Frank, 2012. And the task trial structure looks like this. First, participants are fixated on their screen by a white cross for 1 second. And then they're presented with one picture, okay? And they're asked to press one of the three keys, J, K, or L. And each key will yield different reward amount. And the three different possible reward amounts are $0, $1, or $2. So for example, in this case, if you press J, you will get $2. However, the little tweak we had on this task is that you don't just see $2 on the screen as feedback. You will actually see a splitted amount between you and another target, just like the dictator game. In this case, we tell you what the target occupation is and how much of the reward you generated is split to the target. And of course, you participants themselves keep the other share. And then the feedback is displayed for 2 seconds. For each image, participant plays 12 trials like this. Of course, the trials are grouped into blocks. Before each block, we tell them how all the images they're about to learn. And then there are 6 images. The reason why we chose 6 images is to overload their working memory. Prior research have shown that during instrumental learning, working memory is a crucial part. So we want to block out that countdown and to see the pure reward prediction error-driven learning. And of course, we also tell them ahead of time what percentage of the reward will go to what kind of target, in this case, a nurse. So let's take a look at a example task. So first, you show them 6 images and okay. And here are the conditions. We chose 8 targets. And of course, each participant will see all 8 targets in different blocks. And then they're split into 2 intersubject conditions. One is called disadvantageous condition, in which case the participant always receive the smaller share. And in advantageous condition, vice versa. And for each condition, there are 4 specific ways of splitting the money. And then for each way of splitting, there are 2 blocks corresponding to it. And of course, each condition are randomly mapped to a target condition. Okay, so let's take a look at the data. We collected 99 participants on prolific and excluded people who responded to less than 80% of the trials. So that gives us 94 people remaining. And I plotted here the social perception ratings of all 8 targets collected after participants having completed the task. As we can see, it's a pretty nice spread across warmth and competence space. And here the little crosses are the means for each target group. And then the error bars represent the standard error of the mean. So what this plot shows you is the amount of money, of course, forced upon the participants that's given to the other person, the target, minus a self. So you can see here it would be disadvantageous condition because the other person has more money, and this would be the advantageous condition. And then the darker color is means the higher the warmth or competence rating that the participants perceive the target. We can see a little interaction here, and we run a mixed effect linear model on this, try to predict the total amount of reward participants have gathered during the task, so before splitting, and then predict that using the split condition, the competence rating, and the warmth rating. And we did find all of these predictors to be significant. However, the effect size is very small. All of them are less than 0.1. So I want to caution you to interpret this carefully. Okay, so let's get to the juice of it. We designed 3 models, all based upon this famous reinforcement learning framework to try to instantiate 3 distinct hypotheses about how what's actually going on in participants' mind to generate this model-free behavioral trend. So what is the reinforcement learning framework? There are many variants of it, but the variant we are using here is probably one of the simplest one. So let me briefly run it through. So this framework assumes that people, again, stores certain amount of values for each action, each key press, relative to each image they're about to see. And we call that value a Q value. And then whenever the participant is trying to make a decision, the model would convert this Q value through a softback function into a probability distribution. So that there's a certain probability the participant is going to press J, K, or F, etc. And then from this joint mixture between this distribution and a uniform distribution to capture behavior noise, the model samples one key press, one action, in this case, for example, K. And then the agent will get feedback, in this case, no money. And then we use this feedback to update the Q value. So if there's no impact of social information, we would use the reward before split to put into this framework. And we call that model the naive model, because assuming it's just normal instrumental learning, no influence from target information or split information at all. That's what this model, naive model, instantiates. Of course, a second hypothesis is that there are 2 processes going on. One process learns the reward given to the participant, whereas the other reinforcement learning process learns the reward goes to the target. And then at the end, a choice choosing phase, both of the values combine together to make decisions. And we instantiate this hypothesis into this dual model. So there are dual process. Of course, the third hypothesis is that first, there are some mechanism that integrates both split reward value and social information into one utility, one subjective value, and channels that subjective value into the reinforcement learning system. And then that reinforcement learning system samples actions. So we instantiate that hypothesis into this model framework called SPRL, namely social preference reinforcement learning, for the lack of better terms. So let's take a look at how these 3 models perform. Through a model comparison procedure using the AIC and the BIC, we see that visually, both dual and naive underperform relative to SPRL. So what I'm plotting here is the AIC or BIC score of each alternative models subtract the score of SPRL model. So higher the value means the worse dual or naive is performing in comparison to SPRL. And each dot represents one participant. And of course, the error bar, again, is the standard error of the mean. Because as you can see, there are wide distributions. So we are worried that it will be an outlier effect. So we chose to test the statistical significance using a Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test, which is shown to be a non-parametric method that's robust against outliers. And we see the p-value of AIC is significantly less than 0.05. However, the result for BIC is not as strong. So we need a separate procedure to test which one of this measure is more faithful, is more trustworthy. And then we do that using a model recovery procedure. What a model recovery procedure does is to simulate data using all three of these candidate models, and then fit the simulated data using all three models again. And why should we do that? The reason we do that is if the model comparison procedure is doing a good job, we would expect that each model would best recover the data that's simulated from themselves, right? So for example, if the dual model is the grand truth model and simulates some data, then I fit all three models to that data. We should expect the dual model itself to be the best fitting model for that data, right? Because we actually control what is the grand truth simulating model. So as you can see on the diagonal, what this shows is the proportion of times that this model, the recovery model, is shown to be the best fit according to AIC or BIC. So AIC seems to have a pretty good recovery. All of them are pretty high. But for BIC, the result for SPRL recovery is pretty low. And for naive, it's very high. So what this shows is that perhaps BIC measure that we use is over penalizing for extra parameter in SPRL. So this result would indicate that we should trust AIC more, which is optimistic and supporting our hypothesis. And similarly, we can do a parameter recovery on the model parameters of SPRL to show that the maximum likelihood fitting procedure we used would actually recover the parameters. So the idea is very similar. We chose some numbers for these parameters and simulate some data and use this model to try to fit this data and see if we can obtain the same parameter numbers, parameter values. Okay, so as we can see, most of these parameters did recover pretty well, fairly above 0.6. Well, this shows the Spearman-Rowe correlation between the recovered parameter and the actual grand truth simulating parameter value. So the only two part where it's a bit concerning is softmax temperature, but this is expected because when softmax temperature gets really large, the behavioral effect between them would be very minimal. So what actually some people do, which I have also tried, which didn't change the result that much, is to fix the softmax temperature, excuse me. Another little bit worrying spot is the learning rate. So the learning rate recovery is not that ideal. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I would welcome feedback on this from the audience too. So that's the parameter recovery. And then we can see the parameter values. There's a small interaction here. And another worrying thing about the parameter values is that it seems to be hitting the boundary condition a lot, as you can see here. But if I increase the parameter bound, it tends to not validate very well. So that's also kind of a dilemma that I would welcome feedback from. Okay, so let's take a look at the model validation. So what I did in model validation is to plot the learning curve of all the models and put them to compare qualitatively with the learning curve of the actual participants. As we can see, the SPRL model seems to simulate the learning trend of the actual human, which is the black line here, pretty well, better than the dual and naive model in this case. And again, the error bars represent standard error of the mean. And the y-axis represents the average total reward. And I also plotted the learning curve by each split condition. So just to make sure the averaging didn't really blur any nuances. And as we can see, SPRL still reasonably validated the learning trend of all the participants. So to conclude, I think the current result show preliminary evidence supporting that social information like inequity and social perception does influence instrumental learning by shaping its reward signal using computational modeling. And one special significance, I think, for this study is to exemplify the methodology of integrating existing models to make novel predictions, which in my opinion is one of the greatest gifts that the method of computational modeling bestows upon us. However, I would also encourage interpreting these preliminary results with caution. For one reason, the effect size is very small. And here are 3 reasons that I thought about it. So first, the impact of subjective value could be indirect. So perhaps there are some other processes that goes on between the brain region that represents subjective value and the brain region that represents reward-driven learning that this paradigm hasn't accounted for. And another reason could be because of the sense of earned reward. So one key difference between our design and the dictator game is that participants actually learn how rewarding these images are. So maybe they would have a sense of that the rewards that they gathered through the learning task is somewhat earned. Whereas in the dictator game, they were given this initial endowment for free. And actually prior research has indeed shown in the dictator game framework that if the initial endowment weren't for free, but instead was earned by the participant in some sense, the participants tend to be much less generous. So there is actually a significant behavioral effect in this case. And another reason is that forced split doesn't equal to voluntary split, right? So there's another difference where in our design, we just tell participants the split amount they have to suffer, whereas in the dictator game, they actually can choose which amount to give to the other person. So that's also a distinction that may driven some behavioral differences. So for future direction, we're thinking about trying some other experimental paradigm that would solve some of these above issues. And also as a wild idea, just for now, is to try maybe using a symbolic regression on the dictator game data to learn the utility function instead of what they did was try several syntactic forms and find the best fitting one. But right now it's just a crazy idea, but it sounds cool. So that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and special thanks to my colleagues at the Jenkins lab for their feedback and helpful comments. If you have questions, comments, or just want to chat, this is my email. Feel free to reach out.